It's great to be back here in Springfield. I actually started my sort of professional organizing career here in Springfield as an organizer for the National Welfare Rights Organization many years ago. It's an honor to be here on the 20th anniversary of the AADERT conference and to try to talk about these great movements that we have in our times, Arab Spring and Occupy. What I can offer, hopefully, is some personal experiences with movements and with social change that might be helpful. So as Danny said, I spent 38 years as the founder of ACORN, June 1970 to June 2008. I began here as a welfare rights organizer in Springfield, Mass. There's what the welfare office used to look like when welfare was, before it was no longer welfare as we know it, it was welfare as it was then. Been working with ACORN International, as Danny identified, for the last 10 years. We began originally in Peru and now work throughout Latin America, India, Kenya and Liberia are the two countries in Africa where we have projects, and have been working for a long time now, the last 4 years in Korogocho and Nairobi. We also work in Italy and the Czech Republic, and we have some diverse experiences that we can share. It's been a crash course for me, learning about what's going on past North America and the U.S. and Canada. Before adding my 2 cents to these deliberations, I have to give some disclosures. One has to do with Glenn Beck, and the other has to do with Andrew Breitbart. Glenn Beck, as many of you know, was a voice in Fox News for the right wing. In fact, the last time I was here at Springfield College, a bunch of his people picketed outside, and it was very exciting for people. They got to walk through picket lines and wonder what in the world was going on. Here, we had to call up the rain to, discourage any kind of that activity. But the disclosures really have to do with the Arab Spring and the Occupy movement, because in the polarization that exists here in the United States, one of the things that was very important for Glenn Beck was they were taken by surprise on the right when the events of the Arab Spring broke out, particularly the activity in Cairo. So they started looking for how there might be conspiracies as opposed to advancements of democracy. When things started happening in Tahrir Square in Cairo, what Glenn Beck argued is somehow we were organizers of the Arab Spring because of a simple thing where we had suggested some 9 months before that the Organizers Forum, a collection of an ad hoc group that comes together every year to go visit some other country in the world, community and labor organizers, had announced in October of 2010 that we were going to go to Cairo and try to see what was up with that country. What was Murabak doing? What was the Muslim Brotherhood all about? What were community and labor organizations doing there? Well, from that small thread, he wove a huge multicolored jacket that you couldn't have the events in Cairo without somebody like me stirring it up, even though I was certainly not a primary organizer of that movement or any of these events. Same thing with our friends Andrew Breitbart and big government websites on the right wing. As Zuccotti Park started assembling the Occupy Wall Street movement, he was convinced that me and others were the organizers behind that. I'll tell you, it's all quite an honor, but we didn't organize it, and we're big cheerleaders, and we have a lot to learn from it, but the full disclosure is if you Googled it and somehow thought what you were going to hear was the real inside story of how Cairo happened, or the inside story of the Occupy Wall Street movement, this is the outside story, a little closer maybe than you've been, but what we can learn about social movements, change, and these times. I mean, the first thing to really come to grip with in trying to understand social change is it's a roller coaster. It's up and down, there's nothing easy about it. The mythology of movements would have you believe that they spring spontaneously out of Zeus's head, that it's something that no one is expecting, no one's ready for, and all of a sudden, boom, there's a movement the next day. Clearly that's not true, but it is true that movements, when they occur, are sort of volcanic disruptions of social change. They make the landscape ecologically different for organizing for things that we thought we knew and were perceived wisdoms or cultural expectations or so many other things. All of a sudden the map is different, the terrain moves differently, the temperature is different. It's actually interesting working in Sicily as an organizer now, because as you drive between Palermo and Paterno, where we worked in both cities, you can sometimes see Mount Etna exploding at night. This is actually not Mount Etna, but it's quite an amazing thing, these volcanoes. Movements are inevitable. The timing is the only thing that's unpredictable. In the Arab Spring, the speed of change in Tunisia caught most people off guard. And perhaps you could argue a case that it was more spontaneous than some other places. The Arab Spring, and as it hit Cairo, was certainly different than that. And although we are clear about movements not being spontaneous, sometimes it's more difficult to clearly identify what forces sort of are operating behind the screen, what hands are behind the curtain, if you will, where the organizers are and who the organizers are. Having been to Egypt, what we can share from something we've learned is that talking to unions, talking to several of the presidential candidates, unfortunately we didn't meet with any of the candidates that ended up prevailing in the recent election, but we got a much better sense of how that movement really came to be. And what I'm going to share with you is sort of a list of items of what we learned. One is that this was not a Facebook revolution, nor was Gene Sharp, who is perhaps the most prominent philosopher of nonviolent social change anywhere in the world right now. He operates the Albert Einstein Center out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And although he's a great promoter of this activity and was a key organizer leading to the yellow revolutions in Eastern Europe and the ACORN movement particularly, on the ground it became clear that although Gene and Aptor had done a lot of training there and were instrumental, they were not, they were useful rather than being instrumental. What did make a big difference in Egypt that was confusing in the way that most of you may have heard about this, as I say, it wasn't a Facebook thing, but it was clear once you were there that the events, the Arab Spring in Egypt, could not have happened without huge activity by labor unions. Unions were state-controlled in Egypt, and in fact still are, even more than a year after the revolution. But independent unions and others, even the state unions, had been consistently on what almost amounted to a general strike throughout that period. The inability of Mubarak and his military to stop those strikes gave huge momentum to the activities in Tahrir Square. The other thing that can't be discounted, and anybody who reads huge amounts of publicity in the United States particularly probably has reservations and concerns for what the growth of the Muslim Brotherhood might mean. But the Muslim Brotherhood was the most experienced organizational and political player, having been underground for decades. It had a trained and disciplined, not cadre, but base of organizers who were able to take advantage of the disruption that came with the Tahrir Square movement. Here's a picture of one of the younger Muslim Brotherhood organizers we met with, who it was sort of interesting. The younger organizers and some of the older leadership are widely different. And this is, as I say, if we have questions later, is a much more diverse movement than you would expect, and not necessarily the way we're being led to believe. Not surprisingly, they are reaping the benefits from having organizational capacity. And one of the things that you build organizations for is to take advantage of movement opportunities. If you have no organizational capacity, the opportunity and event of movements sometimes can't be implemented into real change. And that's what we're seeing in a number of countries, and even in some of the loss of possibilities already in Egypt, is not having the organizational infrastructure ready. The other thing that's very clear in Egypt is that when we talk about it being a revolution of the young, it really is more a revolution of young people if we define young people as being people in their 30s and 40s. This was a generation of people who felt like they were being disempowered, and their opportunity to advance in Egypt and in many other countries in the Middle East was being thwarted by the economy and by elite control of government apparatus, which meant even though professionally trained, even though in some cases educated, with young children to support families, they weren't able to make a living. They would be taxi cab drivers, they would be tourists, they had linguistic skills, they might be leading tours of the pyramids, and this led to, not surprisingly, huge disenchantment with existing political norms. And in Egypt, as it appeared that Mubarak was going to transfer power within his family, this sort of changed the notion for many younger, mature adults, believing that they had a ceiling they could break through instead of one that was going to trap them. The other thing, and I don't know if everyone saw this account at the time, it's obviously impressed me hugely, is that after the New York Times and other publications were reporting the events in Tahrir Square, the sort of first spin for people trying to take credit, and the government agencies who funded the new, some of the programs and the op tours and whatever, all trying to get their licks in. This was a leaderless movement in the sense that people from the outside couldn't identify the leaders. There's a very interesting story that David Kirkpatrick did of the Times, and he's been following the events in Egypt and the Middle East for some time, where one of the 14 initial organizers took him around to basically show them how they put together the movement that erupted in Tahrir Square. And what they had been doing for some time, not surprisingly, there's always a history in every movement of protest and social change activities before it sort of erupts in this volcanic way that we now see here, and that some of us have been lucky enough to see here in this country in the past. But what they had been doing, that Mubarak and the police were willing to tolerate, is that they had been talking to themselves. They'd been trying to demonstrate in middle income, upper middle income areas, among the intellectuals and intelligentsia, trying to basically get their cohort to come join them. It was one of those, I'm out here, come with me. So they've done rallies, and the police would surround them. There'd be 50 of them, 40 of them, 20 of them, maybe 100 on a big day, and the police essentially would let them do it, tolerate it, cordon them off. It would be over, they would slink away, not having made the difference, not having attracted a base. Finally, this 14, and one of the 14 was the Facebook executive who, some people have, overemphasized his role, but he was somebody who helped on the tech side, realized that what they needed to do was listen to people. And listening is the single most important criteria for all organizing. And in listening to people, they started to realize that the real issues people were talking about were not political corruption, which they cared about, were not the loss of opportunity politically, which they cared about, were not a number of other things, but were jobs and housing. So they, instead of going where they had been, they changed their strategy and went into the lower income areas, not far off of Tahrir Square, and talking to people about coming to join them, follow them into the square where we can protest the lack of real jobs with livelihoods that can be protected, family supporting livelihoods, and decent housing. And to their surprise and amazement, when they started putting this word out, they would turn around and thousands of people were coming out of the doorways of these homes in the slums to follow them into the square.